I wanted to explain how I figured out about where this treasure was. And so it started off as me and an old girlfriend of mine were talking about this treasure for several years. And a year went by, another year went by, and several years went by, and nobody had found it. So a couple years ago, I decided I'd go figure out this treasure for everybody. And so I'm sitting in a beach house and having breakfast in my underwear down in Mexico, and I read the poem, and I said, well, hell, I know what that means. And so I read the Fenn clues, and so I called up to Montana, and I called a fishing guide, and I asked him if he knew where this river was, and he said, yeah. And I said, if you go down that river, is there a creek at the, when you come down that river through this canyon? And he said, yeah, how would you know that if you've never been here? And I said, well, let me ask you something. Is there a bunch of wood stacked up on that creek, on the banks of it? And he said, no, but there's a petrified forest at the end of the creek. So I instantly knew right then that's where the treasure was. So I head up to Montana, and I buy the book, The Journal of a Trapper by Osborne Russell, and I read it on the hotel room on the way up, and it talks about trappers going up and down around the mountains, killing animals and half starving to death. And some night they started a big blaze and to cook some food. So I thought the blaze was a fire, and so I thought that I had to go up to the petrified forest and find an old campfire from a trapper back in the 1830s. And I hiked up and down all around that damn forest trying to find campsites, and I found one in particular that looked like a perfect Girl Scout campground, and like a perfect little pyramid that somebody had built. And I thought, well, hell, that's got to be it, So I had some nephews of mine and a son and my brother were up there, and I told them damn kids, I drew them a map of where it was, told them to go up there and get that treasure, And they went up there, and there was nothing there, and they thought I was just batshit crazy. So anyway, they left, and everybody thought I was out of my mind. But anyway, I came back up here again, and I'm sitting there fighting with an old girlfriend of mine, and I look over to the side of the forest, and there is I noticed that the trees are all been burnt, and there's like a regrowth, So I get on Google Maps and I look at the entire forest, and I see that there's some regrowth along the Tom Miner Creek, and so I go and search through all that regrowth trying to find a fireplace, and I couldn't find one, and or a campfire, I should say. And so then I walk all the way to the back of that Tom Miner Creek back toward the Bighorn Basin, and I get my binoculars out. I notice the first thing I noticed was a Forest Service guy stealing all my shit, and the next thing I noticed was there's some over across the valley. There was some more, a little spot of new growth trees too. So I hiked over there, and lo and behold, I find that magical waterfall, and so I instantly knew that. From reading a book that he said he tossed rocks off the top of the waterfall. So I instantly knew that the treasure was up at the top of that specimen ridge. And anyway, long story short, I ended up going back up there and getting in a car accident. My car went off a 450-foot cliff and smashed it all to hell, and I ended up in the hospital with a dislocated shoulder. So I went home for the year, and I went back last spring. And so last June 9th, 2019, I figured out where that treasure was. I marked it on a map, and I sent it to some friends in case I got hurt going back up there again. And so now I'm gonna walk you through the journey of the book and explain to you what everything is, and what how magical this book is if anybody ever takes the time to read it. So over the winter, I was talking to a friend of mine, Tommy, who's also been an avid kind of a searcher on this from a computer at home. And he had told me that he thought that the blaze was a mark on a tree. And so I went back through and read that Journal of a Trapper again, and lo and behold, the only part of the book that's in italics is a part about where Osborne Russell bought some land in Oregon, and they had marked off some oak trees and stuff with blazes. And so I thought, well, I'll keep my eye out for, besides campfires, I'll keep my eye out for some trees. And so I went down the Tom Miner Road all the way to the end. You stay to the left like the end is ever drawing nigh. And I walked all the way up Sunlight Creek, and I took the Skyrim Trail across the top of it, and I get to a spot where there's about a 20-foot wall of snow, and I can't go any farther. And so I have to turn around and come back. And I went back home and waited for the snow to melt some more, and I came back up on June 28th. Went back up there again, and it snowed 12 inches on me up there on June 28th. And then I ended up going over to Europe for a vacation with my kids to Italy and around Greece and so forth, around the Mediterranean. Anyway, I came back, and I finally made it up to the top of that ridge, and I found two trees up there that in particular that had markings on them, and they both say the same thing on them, and they say APS35 BT. And so I hired a surveyor and asked him what that meant, and it meant angle point section 35 bearing tree. And there's two of them up there. So from reading Forrest books, he talked about how his house caught on fire, and there's two juniper trees on each side of his house. And so I instantly knew that those were the blazes. And the one blaze in particular, the one that's on the head of Specimen Ridge, is in the book he talks about a Rosetta Stone, and he keeps talking about Head Jim Dam. And so it turns out if you take a ruler and you draw a line from Heb Jim Dam over to Old Yellowstone Road, it intersects right where that tree is. And so that's how I knew that tree is the blaze. And so further in the book, he talks about how the treasure was, this guy was 80 feet from an alligator. So I took some pictures of the trees up there, and I sent them off to a gal at the Coconino National Forest in Arizona, where I live. And I asked her if she could tell me what kind of trees those were, and she told me that they were alligator juniper trees. And so I knew instantly that the treasure was 80 feet from that alligator juniper tree. And so now I'm going to take you and kind of walk you through the treasure in the book, and go step by step of how Forrest just literally walks you every couple feet to the entire treasure. So here we go. So when you read the poem starts out, "As I have gone alone in there, and with my treasures bold, I can keep my secrets where, and hint of riches new and old. Begin it where warm waters halt, and take it in the canyon down, not too far, but too far to walk, put in below the home of Brown. From there it's no place for the meek, the end is ever drawing nigh, there'll be no paddle up your creek, just heavy loads and water high. If you've been wise and found the blaze, look quickly down your quest to cease, but tarry scant with marvel gaze, just take the chest and go in peace. So why is it I must go and leave my trove for all to seek? The answer I already know. I've done it tired, and now I'm weak. So hear me all and listen good. Your effort will be worth the cold. If you're brave and in the wood, I give you title to the gold." On the next opposite page of that, he said that there's other subtle clues sprinkled in the stories. It's vital that nobody share my knowledge about the location of the treasure. Two people could keep a secret if one of them's dead. I dreamed the other night that I had been reincarnated as Captain Kidd, and I went to Gardner's Island looking for the treasure. It scared me so badly that I was jarred awake, and I don't remember whether I found it or not. So that's the first clue in the book, and that's basically tells you where to start from. Gardner is Montana, and he couldn't be any more true about if two people could keep a secret if one of them's dead. I couldn't keep a secret, and I ended up telling two other ladies where this treasure was, and that's something I'm gonna have to regret for a while. But anyway, here we go. Okay, so you start in Gardner, Montana. So the first clue Forrest says where you need to start is begin at where warm waters halt. So if you go north out of Gardner, you're going to come to the first thing you're going to come to is a thing called Leduc Springs, and so that's what begin at where warm waters halt is. Now, before we go any further, I need to explain something about the treasure. Forrest tells you over and over again that Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge, and so you got to use your imagination to find this treasure and imagine all this stuff in your mind. And so one of the first things he tells you is he was in grade school, and he couldn't stand his teacher, and he sat in the back of the classroom, and there was like an old fire escape out of the back of the building there, and so he would slide down the fire escape, and it would leave a heavy brown stain on his breeches. And so right where you come to that warm waters halt, there's also a thing called Devil's Slide there, and if you see by the picture, it's got a heavy brown stain on it, and so that's the slide that he would escape down when he was in grade school. Begin where warm waters halt and take the canyon down, not too far, but too far to walk. Put in below the home of Brown. On your way down the canyon, if you look off to the woods to your right, you will see religious figures sitting out in the middle of the woods, and he talks about this guy carved this Moses statue for him, and that he stuck outside and let it weather on a windowsill, and so that I thought that was the Moses. And so then if you go further down the canyon, it says so then you go down and it says not too far, but too far to walk. Put it in below the home of Brown. And the home of Brown is an old trapper used to live up on top of the mountain there. And there's a Yankee Jim put in. They also call it the Joe Brown put in. And so that's put in below the home of Brown. From there, it's no place for the meek, which is Yankee Jim Canyon, which is a Class 3, Class 4 rapids that you got to shoot through this canyon. The end is ever drawing nigh. Drawing nigh means to stay to your left. There'll be no paddle up your creek, just heavy loads and water high. So on your way to take a left to do your ever drawing nigh, you cross a bridge across the Yellowstone River, which is the Leon Bridge that he talked about jumping off of in Texas. And then you pass the Katy Railroad. After you cross that bridge, you cross an old railroad, and Forrest said that if the wind was out of the east, you could hear the train on the Katy Railroad. So that's the Katy Railroad. It's an old railroad that goes from Livingston, Montana to Gardner. Okay, so then you go further down the road, and the first thing you come to is a wigwam lodge. And so he talks in the poem about this guy always trying to sell him teepee poles and stuff, and so that's the first thing you come to. The next thing you come to, let me back up a second before I get you going down this timeline and road too far. There's a couple things I didn't mention. Is so when you put in below the home of Brown, Forrest said that the treasure is 8.25 miles north of Santa Fe, and it's between there and the Canadian border. But what 8.25 miles north of Santa Fe is it's the distance between the Joe Brown put in. If you go 8.25 miles north, you come to Old Yellowstone Road, and that he tells you a story about an old Indian tribe down in Texas, and so he's routing you a different way to get back there. Going across this bridge that I'm taking you is just a shortcut, but the way that the Forrest is wanting you to go is he wants you to go 8.25 miles north of the Joe Brown put in, and then go down that old Yellowstone Trail 17 miles to get to where the treasure is. So, all right, so we're going to go back and we're going to go proceed down this Tom Ida Road, and I'm going to explain to you everything that you're going to pass along the way. And keep in mind again that you have to use your imagination to imagine all this stuff. And anything that Forrest tells you in the book twice, you better know what it is. And so anyway, I'm gonna. There's dozens and dozens of things that I've left out, but this is going to basically walk you step by step to the treasure, and it'll make you understand how brilliant this book is. Okay, so here we go. So then the next thing you come to is Cody the buffalo. Now he tells you that Cody the buffalo, it was 7 miles west of West Yellowstone, and they went out and roped this old buffalo, and there was an old sagebrush flat 7 miles west of town. So if you take Old Yellowstone Road and you go 7 miles west, it'll bring you to a sagebrush flat, and that's Cody the buffalo. And then in the book there's a picture of him holding some trout on a stringer. That's the next thing you're going to come to. So then after that, he tells you in the book about his two favorite pets were these donkeys. Sorry, I couldn't get the word out. And they're called Dolly and Lollipop. So the next thing you're going to come up to are his donkeys, Dolly and Lollipop. Okay. From there, you're going to proceed down the road again, and the next thing you're going to come to is Lion's Ledge. He tells you when he was in Williams, Arizona, him and a buddy went out, and they were going to shoot some varmints, and they ended up having a mountain lion come charging down this canyon, and Forrest had to jump off this ledge and hold onto a tree to go down and get the mountain lion. He wished he hadn't done it, but anyway, that's the next thing you come to is the mountain lion. And then after that, so then after that you come to the next thing down the road is he tells you he always wanted to own a cattle company, and so he decided to make his publishing company the One Horse Land and Cattle Company. So the next thing you come to is one horse on a sign, and then on the sign across the street says Land and Cattle Company. From there, the next thing you come to is a one-room schoolhouse. He tells us about how his dad used to go 50 miles down an old dirt road in Wyoming and show him this schoolhouse that had a writing on the door that I can't remember what it said, but anyway, he also tells you that his dad used to be a school teacher, and he was a big deal. He became principal, and so he got his own parking spot, and they hammered a wooden parking sign in the ground that said Mr. Fenn Principal. And so that's the next thing you come to, and this is no longer there, by the way. It's somebody has taken the sign down. Okay, from there you come to a big rock, and behind that big rock is a mountain that in his last book he's got a picture of a painting that he's doing with a pencil, and where that pencil is actually where the treasure is. And he talks about how this mountain's, or he talks about how George Washington, the picture on the dollar bill, is actually reversed from what the picture was. But anyway, somehow you flip-flop that mountain around in that gorge there behind that big rock, but where his pencil is on that page, I believe it's 54 of his last book, that's actually where the treasure is. So then you proceed down the road a little farther, and you come to where the old biddies live. And he said that these old biddies live down the street, or down the block from him in Texas. And how I know that that's the old biddies house is that's where I sent my truck off a 450-foot cliff back there, and the tow truck driver was telling me what horrible people they were. He used to work for the lady and wanted to buy a truck from her that was all rusted out in the field. She told him she'd rather watch it rust than sell it to him. So then after that, immediately after her driveway, you come to a locked gate, and he tells you that he took his old football coach Chauncey for one last fishing trip at this place called Garib Lake in Yellowstone Park, and that the lake was 3 miles beyond this lock gate, and so that's the Garib Lake is where there's the entrance into the petrified forest. From there, the next thing you're going to come to is he talks about Thor a couple times, and Thor's the god of lightning, and he also talks about this general that was the general of the Air Force Academy, and how he had they wanted to put lightning back in the clouded sheaths, and the lightning is on the meadows of B-Bar Ranch, and the clouded sheath is the snow that goes around the edge of the forest. So that's your Thor and your lightning putting back in the clouded sheaths. So then the next thing you're going to come to is a one-room cabin, which he said he used to stay in this one-room cabin west of Yellowstone there, and that's where they hung out every summer, and so that's the one-room cabin. Okay, so from there you're gonna come around the corner and you're gonna see a bunch of microwave towers. So he talks in his last book about this lady. He's standing in line in the grocery store, and this lady's got a bunch of curlers and stuff in her hair, big old curlers, and he asked her how many channels she could get on that thing, and so that microwave tower is the curlers in that girl's hair at the grocery store. So the next thing you're going to come to is, if you stay to your left and draw an eye, it'll take you back, and you're going to end up at a fence. And that fence is where Forrest, he went to college, but he didn't pay his tuition, and so after a few days they caught on and called his name, and he ran off from college, and he ended up having to crawl underneath a barbed wire fence and spend the night with some cows, and that's where you have to go slip underneath that fence, and you go back all the way to the back of that canyon is where you find that magical waterfall. And so I'm going to show you a hodgepodge video. I've got 4K video on some of these other things, but this is just going to give you an idea of what the heavy loads and water high is. So that's how you got to find it, to slip underneath this fence. So as this video is running, I'm going to tell you, so he tells you about this old Inuit Indians, or some kind of Indian tribe down in Texas, and they're naked, and they can't speak Spanish or English or anything. They just kind of grunt and moan and eat bugs and grubs and whatever they can kill in this creek bed. But in the book, the Journal of a Trapper, it talks about this sheep eater tribe that this trapper Osborne Russell comes across, and talks about how they're in this beautiful valley that where the creek runs north through it, but he tells you that Indian tribe's 17 miles down an old dirt road, and so if you go 17 miles from the old Yellowstone Road to back there, it basically lines up with where that waterfall is, and so once you find that waterfall, then you know that he was tossing rocks off the top of the waterfall in Vietnam, and so the thing that sucks is after you walk 11 hours back there and back to find a waterfall, you got to come back out. Now you got to walk another 10 miles down the Sunlight Creek to get to where the blaze is, which is when he talks about too far to walk, he talks about where he went from Baker's Hole and fished downstream on the Madison River, and where the bends in the river was the best fishing, and the bends of the river is where the horseshoe is that he found in he talks about shoeing a horse, and then he talks about this old Spanish conquistador saddle that they found, and So basically, you've got to walk 5 miles up that Sunlight Creek and around that Sky Rim Trail, and that'll take you. If you go exactly 5 miles, it'll take you to the Blaze Tree. And but we're gonna go a different way, because if you go up Sunlight Creek, it gives you a whole bunch more clues, and tells you all the different stuff that's in the book. So I'm gonna take you as soon as this video gets done. I'm gonna take you back up to Sunlight Creek, and we're gonna start from there. He talks about his daughter, and he shows like this moss growing in the river, and it talks about how it reminds of his daughter and her fingers in the sunlight. And her fingers in the sunlight are just the creek that come off Sunlight Creek is what he's talking about in his daughter's hair. And so now we're going to go up Sunlight Creek, and I'm going to show you a bunch more clues. So if you take this road all the way to the end, this is old Forest Service road that he talks about. Him and his friend went on a horseback ride, being Lewis and Clark. And he talks about how they got saddle sore, and they the only thing they had was a map of the Gallatin National Forest. So that tells you that the treasure's in the Gallatin National Forest. And he talks about how they got lost, and they went down this creek that got steeper and deeper and harder and faster, and the only thing they could get through it was water, and they had to turn around and go a different way to get out to this old Forest Service road. So that where that Sunlight Creek road ends is where the Forest Service road, and if you go up that Sunlight Creek is where that water gets steeper and faster. And so he talks about when he was a kid, he had to milk a cow, and there was the cats would come around for get a free shot of milk, and they're like socks hanging on a clothesline. So he also talks about stuff further down the barn, and so you got to go all the way to the back of that Sunlight Creek, the back of that canyon. That's further down the barn. He talks about when he was going to a dance, and it was about a mile up to the high school, and the high school is a school of bats. The entire book's about bats. It's all subliminally told to you, but the entire book's about bats. And how I figured that out was they have a section in there about Captain Marvel, and I said, well, hell, nobody likes Captain Marvel. You know, kids either like Batman or Superman, but nobody ever liked Captain Marvel. So I got to looking at the comic of the book, and I noticed that he had a little sidekick that was kind of like Batman's Robin. So that's when it clicked to me that this whole book's about bats. So if you go back and read this book, it'll talk about things flying off the walls. It'll talk about the feet in the water. It'll talk about the people's capes and like art images with stuff wrapped around. That all signifies bat wings. And so if you go back and through, and every single chapter it's all about bats. This entire book's about bats. So it'll kind of blow your mind that when you can read it 50 times, but unless somebody told you. But in these other books that I've got, I've highlighted everything that there's a bunch of stuff I didn't highlight, but for the most part, every book's highlighted with what you need to know and what you need to figure out. So in addition to that, he talks about going down the Verde River in Arizona, and so this video is basically a drone flyover of Sunlight Creek, and if you take this creek all the way up to the back, that right there is the football. So he talks about how he had a 5-finger football, and that he scored a touchdown with in 7th grade, and that's the football right there. If you see it on a topo map, I'll send you a better picture, but it's you can really distinctly tell it's a football. But he talks about going down this the Verde River in Arizona, and He talks about, this creek comes up and this horseshoe creek comes up, and then all of a sudden he comes up where the Verde meets the Fossil Creek. And so this is where the Verde meets the Fossil Creek, is where the green turns into Sunlight Creek up here. There's an old avalanche chute up here, and when it, most of the year there's snow on top of it, but you can see a big spot of green coming up here, and that's where the Verde meets the Fossil Creek. So this is the football right here. You can see an outline of it. If you look closely, that's what the football is. And then he also tells you about those horseshoes. So at the back of that canyon there is where the horseshoe is. And where the start of that Sunlight Creek is, back around that mountain, is where the horseshoe is. And along that Skyrim trail there's a alligator juniper tree there, and then there's a juniper tree over there on the head of the Sunlight Creek where that, or Specimen Ridge, where that starts. And so he tells you that there's some things that are worth investigating higher up, and he tells you about, that the 80 feet from the alligator. So my guess is that treasure is 80 feet from the alligator, and he talks about that general I have flown home, and all of his bat innuendos. I would imagine that it's in a bat cave there, and that he talks about how he found an old can of chew, and he's got a smashed up pop can in his picture of his garage, like a fake Andy Warhol picture or something. And so I imagine in that cave is going to be a smashed up pop can and a can of old can of Copenhagen or something, and so that's it for the treasure. That's what I know. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. And then you. Post it. I almost forgot. One of the most important things is that he talks about his brother being found dead in 90 feet of water in Cancun, and so I imagine that you got to be down 90 feet of water. But he said the most important, or they should have buried his brother standing up. And all along this mountain, there's hundreds of petrified trees that are buried standing up from an old volcanic eruption. And so he said that his brother was above him, and he was in the middle, and blah blah blah. So this is what being buried standing up is. That's it. Thanks. Yeah. But we want this one on there. Is what we want. This right here. Every one of them. So we'll put this one on. Yes. Put all those wood pictures in there.
This is like extra.
No, and these are the exact GPS coordinates of all the different pictures I just told you about, and then that map at the end there with the X on it. I sent that to a friend of mine exactly 1 year ago today.